Thank you, Susan.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Joe, and of course Jaime. Not only a colleague, but an old friend. We go way back. And on behalf of the Center for Hemispheric Policy, we are very pleased to be co-sponsoring this session with you. Just a word or two about the center for those of you. I don't think it's picking up very well. Is it? For those of you who don't know it very well, essentially we put on programs for the greater Miami community having to do with political, economic, and social and foreign policy issues involving Latin America. We bring in speakers from Latin America and from other parts of the world, and of course from Washington, New York, and other parts of the U.S. We have our annual conference coming up. Susie, what's the date of?
April 5th.
April 5th, which will be we're having as guest speakers Moises Naim, who has a new book out, and we have the Ortiz, who is the chief economist. We do so many programs, I can't. Luis Gomez, who's the chief economist at the IMF, and we have the Brazilian ambassador, and then we have a number of panels on different issues. So any of you who would like to be included on our mailing list, Susie Davis over there, who's in the red, who's the associate director of the center, just give her your card and we'll put you on our mailing list, and we would be very pleased to have you join us. Okay, now the topic of how to resolve conflicts in Latin America. What I think we're hoping for at this conference is that once someone like myself talks about how conflicts have been managed or resolved in Latin America, we're looking for lessons perhaps that might or might not be applied to other regions of the world. As Jaime has pointed out, there have been a significant number of conflicts throughout the history of Latin America, but it's interesting that in many ways, if you think about it, in the modern time, there really have been many, many fewer armed conflicts in Latin America. I mean, the two big wars that Jaime talked about, the War of the Pacific and the Triple Alliance, they go way back. So if you look recently, there haven't been armed conflicts. There's been a lot of conflict, but it hasn't been usually subject to a military outbreak or an armed clash. And so when I was looking over the literature on these disputes, you look for certain reasons why a particular region may behave a little differently from other regions, in this case in terms of armed conflict. And one of the observations, I'm going to go through a number of things that make Latin America somewhat different perhaps from other regions, and then also look at, mention some things involved in conflict resolution in Latin America that might be relevant or have important ideas for resolving territorial conflicts elsewhere. Well, the first thing is that most people agree that Latin America hasn't been as conflictual in terms of military conflict. At least I'm going to focus more on the modern period, basically the 20th century into the current one. And one of the reasons given for it is that throughout its history, in some ways, it's been pretty isolated from other regions of the world. I remember when I was on the policy planning staff at State, the last half year of Carter and into the first year of the Reagan administration, and we would have a policy planning meeting once a year. No, I'm sorry, once a week with the other members of the staff who dealt with other regions of the world. And I noticed that when the guy who did Europe spoke, or the guy obviously who did the Middle East or Asia, etc., they all were talking about conflicts or interactions with other parts of the world. But when it came time for Latin America, in relative terms, didn't involve many other areas, and that was striking to me, actually. And so that just kind of confirms the relative level and nature of conflicts being somewhat different in Latin America. And it has, in a sense, Latin America is more isolated. I mean, it's not like the Middle East where something happens and, you know, the region is next door one way, it's next door the other way, it's Europe, it's Asia, etc. So that's one difference for Latin America. The other thing is that compared to other regions of the world, Latin America in particular, or South America in particular, seems to have developed its own balance of power fairly early on, which enabled the region, or the countries of the region, or basically the bigger powers of the region, to resolve the territorial conflicts among themselves. Oh, not always, but you did have local, regional powers that came in and among themselves they were able to resolve problems. Now, in Central America, the situation was different. There weren't strong countries, or the small little countries couldn't resolve it among themselves. And there, the United States, one way or the other, would try and either mediate or impose or work out or encourage. So the U.S. played a bigger role in Central America. It didn't play that much of a role in resolving conflicts in South America. The other aspect of the Latin American situation that seems to be somewhat different from other regions is that Latin America's legalistic tradition seems to have contributed to the development of regional institutions and procedures beginning in the 19th century that encouraged interstate peace. And when that failed, they provided effective international mediation to solve or resolve the conflicts, including when war seemed to break out. I'm going to be more specific later, but I just wanted to want now to lay out some of the special observations about Latin America. Now, contrary to even my perception about how well these international or sub-regional institutions are working, particularly these days, in general, the inter-American peacekeeping institutions, such as the Organization of American States, have been very effective. Now, I generally have a rather cynical position toward the Organization of American States when I don't focus on territorial disputes, because as it turns out, the OAS, as it's called, as you know, has been much more effective traditionally or historically in terms of helping to resolve or contributing to the resolution of territorial disputes than it has been over other issues. Admittedly, in the last decade or so, because in great part of Hugo Chavez and the formation of, in a sense, a split in Latin America between the ALBA-type countries and the rest, it has made it very difficult for the OAS to work effectively because the OAS works by consensus in many ways, and so there's no consensus. There hasn't been any consensus as long as Chavez was around. We'll see what happens in the future, and we can talk about that. But in helping to resolve territorial disputes, it's been pretty good. Now, the other side of this is what people call moral hazard. Moral hazard is sort of when, if you do some kind of behavior which has a good side to it, i.e. helping to resolve conflicts, has the bad side of encouraging a certain amount of irresponsible behavior or risk-taking, because if you know that you have institutional or sub-regional institutions in place, then you figure, well, all righty, you'll risk certain kinds of behavior, and if worse comes to worse, it won't work, and so, you know, the OAS or some kind of other regional institutions or courts or whatever will come in and help resolve it. And so you've had some conflicts that maybe shouldn't have even had started recently, but the countries figured they had maybe a little to lose because if they got bogged down, you know, the OAS or something else would get involved with it. And then more interestingly, in the modern time, and this is true as you'll see in Peru and Ecuador, sometimes issues get resolved, like border issues, for example, because there is a perception, and more recently it's been somewhat accurate, that to continue to prolong these conflicts will harm the developmental prospects of countries which want to develop, which want to grow economically, etc. And to facilitate the importance of thinking about the developmental consequences of prolonged conflict, you have institutions or banks or whatever, you have integration systems, etc., that these countries want to be part of, they want to have access to the resources, etc. And so that kind of acts as an incentive to not prolong these kinds of disputes too long. Now, on the other hand, so these are things that are somewhat different in Latin America because of the strong structure of sub-regional institutions and this legalistic tradition. Now, there are other aspects of modern conflicts that seem more relevant to other areas of the world, and you know, when I was thinking about because we're looking a lot, we're going to have presentations on Asia that seem more relevant, but maybe this is in general too. We'll see it more in Africa also. In Latin America, some of your territorial disputes come from poorly marked borders. And some of this is because you have jungles in Latin America, you have mountains in Latin America. And so, and these areas were uninhabited or relatively uninhabited. So it didn't fester. It wasn't even seen as a border dispute, and it didn't matter that much that the border wasn't that marked because who cared? I mean, nothing was going on. But as the populations expanded, as you had roads, you know, as you just started moving into areas, perhaps looking for wealth, be it oil, you know, subsoil, minerals, whatever, then suddenly it became more important. Well, there was more conflict over where the border was, with different sides claiming it. And so these are old potential problems that became real problems once the facts on the ground, on the ground changed. Then you had a new kind of a border dispute that, in a sense, started arising in the 80s, which were conflicts over maritime borders. And this is relevant all over the place because I think it was in the early 80s you suddenly had the United Nations, I guess it was Law of the Sea regime or treaty, that said, gave the 200-mile, nautical mile limit in terms of where a country's boundaries were. Well, that's very nice if after 200 miles there's open sea, but it's not so great where, you know, like Cuba and the United States, just, I'm not saying that that was, you know, a big territorial conflict, but it could be because of the oil and stuff. And clearly in the South China Sea, this is a problem. It's because once you have a 200-mile limit, some straits, for example, between countries are less than 200 miles. Or, for example, in the recent Colombian Nicaraguan case, you know, depending on where your, quote, territory ends, like an island, you could end up with the island being part of one country's territory, nationally speaking, but also another country's 200-mile limit. It would be the 200-mile limit. So you've got the problem with maritime boundaries. And then, of course, the other thing that is providing more conflict these days is you have new technologies that enable you to see if there's wealth, for example, under the sea, and if so, whether it can be exploited. So, I mean, you know, for all we know, there's always been oil, you know, off the shores between, you know, in the Gulf of Venezuela. Is that what it's called, the Gulf of Venezuela? Between Venezuela and Colombia. And also in Asia now with the conflicts that are going on in Asia. But you didn't know it, and then when you knew it, you didn't have deep water technology, for example, or for deep water mining to get the minerals. At least you knew you had fish, but that, you know, the stakes aren't as high with fish as with oil and minerals. And so that's happening more in Latin America now, and you're seeing it happening in Asia, and I think it's going to increase in Africa. Then, of course, you've had conflicts that have involved security issues. When I was looking at the Beagle Channel, I didn't think about security necessarily, but it turns out that Argentina, which was very interested in claiming sovereignty for the 3 islands in the Beagle Channel. This was the conflict between Argentina and Chile. One of its professed reasons was they wanted a to have a city or a base of some sort for security reasons further south than the one that was near Buenos Aires. So, to sort of better protect their southern flank. So that's another reason. Of course, related to both the Beagle Channel and the Falklands, which I'll talk about, hello. You also have conflicts that arise because, for mainly domestic political reasons, you've got regimes who seem to be making a mess of their economies, or for other reasons are rapidly losing political support. And so what better way than provoking a conflict that kind of generates nationalistic feelings and support for the regime in trouble? And you could look at a number of conflicts like that, such as the Falklands, for example, which I'll talk about more in a second. Okay, so now let me mention some of the 21st century conflicts and how the above factors may have came into effect. I'm not going into details of every conflict because I figure you don't need to know all that, and I don't even know all of it myself, because when things get too specific and you're not going to use them every day, it's hard to remember them. Okay, Ecuador and Peru, which went to war in the 1990s, were essentially fighting over unmarked territory that remained unmarked essentially because it was jungle area that had been uninhabited. And so as both countries started expanding, you had the other factors coming into play, because you had the belief that the jungle lands held oil or mineral wealth. And there was a conflict that ensued. And how was that one resolved? That one was resolved because four of the largest countries in the hemisphere, in this case Argentina, Brazil, Chile, and the United States, got together to help end the conflict. They helped implement a treaty and a process that started marking, finally, the unmarked border so that you wouldn't have the excuse for conflict in the future. You had the Honduras and El Salvador so-called soccer war, where a riot broke out during the soccer game, but it really wasn't a conflict over soccer. I mean, what it became was a conflict over disputed boundaries and cross-migration issues. This was solved by long negotiations, followed by mediation by a third party, and finally by a judgment rendered by the International Court of Justice in 1992 that actually awarded about 80% of the disputed territory to Honduras. Now this is interesting. I hadn't realized actually until I started focusing on it how many times Latin American countries have been willing to take conflicts at some point in the process to the International Court of Justice. I'm not sure that's the case in many other regions. And then, in this case, the Organization of American States also got involved to help the demarcation of the border process. You had another dispute between Nicaragua and Costa Rica over the San Juan River, which was at one point became a boundary between them. This one also ended up being resolved in part by the International Court of Justice and the OAS. And the OAS in particular helped remove troops, in the case of the Nicaraguan troops, the soldiers that had come into Costa Rica. And Costa Rica actually, even though we say, it got rid of its army in 1948, it's got a pretty sophisticated police force, so they had been involved in the dispute too. And here the court gave Nicaragua the sovereignty over the river, but gave Costa Rica irrigation rights. Now you've got this other factor involved where the river is silting up, and so the course of it is being changed somewhat. So this may be reopened again or festering for quite a while. Now I want to just end with a few of the disputes that seem potentially relevant to some of the conflicts in Asia. I happily, or not happily, readily admit that I am not an Asia expert, but I do read the newspapers, so that's sort of what my concept of these territorial disputes is based on. You have the maritime dispute between Venezuela and Colombia in the Gulf of Venezuela. Now, this is an example of an older dispute that had been initially involved in 1941, but they didn't know at that time that decades later they would need to define the maritime boundary between the two countries. And in 1941, keep in mind, we didn't know, Venezuela didn't know, or nor did Guyana, for that, of Colombia, they didn't know that there was oil in the Gulf, which didn't get really discovered until the 1960s. Plus, this is also an area with lots of mineral wealth. So this is not resolved yet. We'll see what happens. You had the Beagle Channel, which involved Argentina and Chile. And this one I think must be unique in terms of how it got resolved in terms of other regions of the world. They turned to the Pope after they couldn't come to an arrangement themselves. Well, one of the things I didn't mention, obviously, is, in a sense, at least more so than now, you had a lot of religious homogeneity in Latin America. It was very much a Catholic region. So for, Catholic countries, it didn't seem so strange to turn to the Pope. And the other thing I meant to mention in the first part where I said where Latin America was exceptional, there is a sense, at least until fairly recently, maybe still, of there being a region or a certain sense of Latin Americanness in Latin America. Even though you've got so many different countries and you've got, issues among them, there still is a sense that this is a region, that they've got something in common. And in some ways, and sometimes, it helps in the resolution of conflicts across borders. So the Beagle Channel dispute, I mentioned that this was 1978. They turned to the Pope. It involved these three tiny islands that Argentina wanted, and it really wasn't resolved until the military regime in Argentina was replaced by a democratic regime. This raises the question of, does regime type, i.e., does democracy facilitate preventing war? You've got this truism that democracies don't fight with other democracies. Or is there something about democratic processes, or maybe even authoritarian processes, that would help you resolve conflicts? The literature shows it's very inconclusive. But clearly, in this case of the Beagle Channel, it helped when you had democracy, on both sides, as opposed to having to negotiate with the Argentine military. So the two countries in the 80s signed Peace and Friendship Treaty, which gave the islands to Chile, but maritime rights to Argentina, except Argentina didn't get what it wanted, in part, which was some kind of a city or port ability to build that in the south. And then Falklands or Malvinas of '82. That one, I think, in part was a miscalculation. Maybe not. I don't know. Maybe it was a suicide wish on the part of the Argentine military. And I think they didn't think that Margaret Thatcher, would actually try fighting a war so far from its supply lines and its home country, etc. But it turned out that the Argentine military was so woefully unprepared and woefully supplied and woefully unsupported that the British won. It's been revived again now because Cristina Fernández de Kirchner, who again, even though they're not under a military regime, they're having very severe problems, particularly economic problems. Her support is dropping, and suddenly she's decided that it's time to really open this again and solve the problem, because speaking in terms of history, the Malvinas are theirs. But, and this is relevant, I think, to at least one of the island disputes in Asia, the Malvinas were unpopulated for a long time. And it seems to be, from what I've been reading, is that if something is unpopulated, like a little island here or there or a certain region, and some other country comes in and starts populating it, maybe we should think about Texas, actually, that it establishes certain rights on the ground. And so you've just seen Britain Britain called a referendum because the people on the Malvinas or the Falklands are British descent, and the vote was incredible. I mean, I think there were only 3 votes opposed to a continuation of British sovereignty. It was overwhelming that the settlers want nothing to do with Argentina. But President Fernandez said, well, that's ridiculous. You can't have the invaders, deciding they're going to have a vote and actually administer the vote. There was no outside anything, etc. So this dispute isn't finished. And of course, Christina just went to see the new pope and decided, she asked him, would he become involved again? We'll see where this goes, but I don't see Britain submitting it to an international court of justice or anything like that. And then you have the Peruvian, the Nicaraguan Colombian thing is interesting. That was recently resolved. It was an issue that involved maritime boundaries because Colombia had, at least one of its islands was closer to Nicaragua than to Colombia. And so Colombia and Nicaragua both submitted it to the International Court of Justice, which of course Nicaragua had to do because it was the poorer one, the weaker one. Colombia thought it was a slam dunk. Colombia thought it was clear, you know. Well, anyway, Colombia was met with a rude awakening because the court essentially gave most of the maritime territorial rights to Nicaragua and used a complicated formula for figuring out what proportion of overlapping maritime territory rights went to Colombia and went to Nicaragua. So at first there was some talk Colombia criticized it and said they weren't going to accept, but Colombia has a whole long tradition of a very legalistic tradition, and Colombia really couldn't break with it. So anyway, that's an interesting case where you would think that in the future certain countries may look at that precedent, particularly if it involves maritime rights, and decide they're not going to take it to the International Court of Justice. So anyway, and then last, a new Peruvian challenge to Chile in terms of maritime rights, which overlap, and again, resources, I mean, some fish maybe too, but it's basically minerals and potentially oil and maybe gas, and that's not solved yet either. That's a fairly new one. So in keeping with some of our attempt to talk about some relevance of some of these Latin American disputes to Asia, you've got these issues that have started arising more frequently in Latin America that are relevant perhaps to the discussion over Asia. The issue of overlapping maritime boundary disputes, and you certainly have that with the Senkaku Islands. There's another name for them depending on which country is calling them, but these are also islands that are tiny and basically uninhabited. And you've got this belief now that you've got oil and perhaps mineral wealth there, as well as fishing. You have security concerns as an issue. You've got the smaller countries versus China, which is the what do you call it, the 200-pound gorilla. I didn't mention the functional equivalent of the 200-pound gorilla in South America's case, which is Brazil. But Brazil actually expanded its territory without using force. They had incredible diplomatic talent, efforts, personnel, whatever it was. And so that's not the case with China today. So I don't expect a kind of Brazilian version, a Chinese version of Brazil in terms of these conflicts. I think that China is probably going to be behaving more as the great power and, of course, the power in the region. And we've already seen some evidence. And then, of course, all the countries are thinking of the security issues, but I'll leave that all to the Asia panel. And so that is, that's sort of the overview of how I see the resolution of disputes, a lot of which, at least until recently, maybe is not easily acceptable or replicable in terms of the legal propensity, the homogeneity of the region in a sense, and some other issues. Thank you very much.